So hey, I wanted to make a super. I wanted to make a super quick video on the paradox of the grind. And what is that? Well, I was talking to my 16-year-old son Henry yesterday, who is interested in art and design and is working on his program. And the issue came up. About the fundamental paradox of the grind, and what I mean by that is the ability to produce work frequently, to be producing work at all times, is a super important component of an effective studio practice. But there is a paradox, and the paradox is really about a kind of judgment. Blah, 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 blah. In other words, you need to be able to hold two seemingly contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time when working. So when actually working on a piece, it is super important. It's absolutely super important to suspend judgment. So when I'm working on a piece, I'm working in a kind of, I'm grinding, I'm pounding that shit out, right? So as an example, this piece that I'm working on here, yesterday, I am absolutely on fire when working on this. That's the mechanical art for it. And I'm working in a kind of value-free, a judgment-free zone. The critical voice of judgment is, the critical voice of judgment is not engaged when I'm making that type of work. So what's the paradox? The paradox is that in order to, I think, to be effective, there has to be this kind of modal thinking, this kind of switching back and forth between being very, very critical and thinking very, very deeply and very critically about one's work, but when in the process of making the work, the mind is elsewhere in a way, and the most important component is the dedication to the grind, to making fluidly, to continually and habitually producing work almost effortlessly. So the paradox in a way involves a kind of effortlessness with the mark making, and a kind of lack of judgment, and a kind of acceptance of the actual work. So there's almost no criticality involved in this process when producing. These are underpaintings. But so I was talking to Henry about this, and I was saying that, you know, it's a lot of art and a lot of, I think, really high level design is about being able to hold two seemingly contradictory notions, two contradictory truths in mind at the same time, and really they're in some ways about this idea of critical assessment, critical thinking. So, you know, when making this work, I am not in any way in the forefront of my brain engaging a kind of criticality. I'm not engaging does this look right? How is this gonna fit in? That shit is flowing, I can feel it, right? I can feel it. Yet there are these other moments where I'm in my studio and I'm assessing this work, and I'm looking at my oeuvre, the body of my work. I'm literally looking at these pieces, and I am critically assessing them. I'm looking at them I'm looking at what I see as the flaws of the work. I'm looking at what I see as the problems of the work, and I'm attempting to systematically address those issues. So I think there are two or three really main points, and the first is, for me anyway, I'm striving to produce freely and at a very, very high rate, and that doesn't mean to give short shrift, to not be dedicated to the craft of the object. In other words, in these pieces, I'm very, very dedicated to being thorough and rigorous about the work. But again, paradoxically, that has to flow. It has to be something that simply happens in a kind of easy way. So the arc of the work isn't easy. The lifetime of the work is dedication to the grind. But the actual piece itself has to be very, very easy. No, look out the road. So setting up conditions where creating is fluid and easy. So as an example, having multiple bodies of work that are working at the same time, that are all working at the same time. So paintings that are overlapping with screen prints. With the text lapsing over into the text from those pieces lapsing over into written books like ebooks or regular zine publications, but to set up a kind of condition where each piece feeds back into the other piece. My interest really lies in the capacity to be producing, to be making art, design, typography with a kind of fluidity and ease that the absolute fundamental issue is this idea of balance. Figuring out exactly and precisely, emotionally, when and where to use the critical voice of judgment, because without criticism, without a kind of analytical approach to the work, without rigor and discipline, the work itself suffers. But if that is engaged, if that type of cognition, that type of thinking is engaged when I'm actually in the process of producing the work dies. The work slows down, it grinds to a halt, it has no feeling, it has absolutely no mystery to it. It becomes overly analytical, and it is a huge problem. So, to my mind, the critical component is understanding emotionally when criticality is something to be engaged. I think there's a kind of freedom. There's a kind of freedom that comes from this process, where when you're in the process of actually making the work, when you're making the piece, no judgment, man, judgment-free zone, right? Afterwards, when it's in your studio, when the finished piece is in your studio, that's a different story entirely. You have to be brutal. You have to be absolutely brutal about what is working, what isn't. You have to look at, I look at my own work, I look at pieces next to one another, and I try to understand what the leitmotifs are, what the motifs in the work are, try to understand what I see as working and what I don't, and be very rigorous about notes, about research. But when I'm doing this, and when I'm in the process of drawing or creating these pieces, all of that is gone. So that paradox lies at the very heart, I believe, of what I do, and I think at least one form of sophisticated practice. So I think a pretty good example is in episode 80 as an example, which was the last episode that I did the text that both Rory and I generated, and the ideas that Rory and I generated for this critique of my work, were fed back into a précis, so a diagram of Rory's argument, a PDF that he designed of his work, and then an ebook which had some supplemental material to it. But the point really is the idea of trying to figure out the tendrils, the variety of materials that are being produced, and to see in what ways they can kind of propagate, they can kind of grow horizontally across mediums, and to keep that fluid. And I honestly believe that you can feel, or I can feel when I can feel when the spirit is moving. I can feel when that shit is just working fluidly. And to my mind, it's the blocks and the getting out of the zone that stop that from happening. And again, a kind of critical thinking that is applied in the wrong moment that is a fundamental problem that I believe needs to be overcome. So when I'm grinding on a print or a painting or a piece of typography or language or a book, or almost any aspect of my studio practice, I can feel that. Shit. I can absolutely feel it. I can feel it when. So when I'm grinding on a book or a piece of typography, a print, any kind of work, it's as if the thing is unstoppably being produced, and that if I pause, I know these are all artistic cliches, but it's almost as if I pause in the process of making the work, or if my work process is disrupted, that the piece leaves me. Chris Pinter, who was a graduate student in the studio, mentioned that he heard this saying that if you leave a painting for a day, it leaves you for 3. I think I've mentioned that before, but it's one of the most profound things that I've heard, because it really taps into something essentially true, I think. There's a kind of urgency that I can feel in the work, where it becomes this physical act of making. That is another huge component of the equation that I think is underplayed, is, for me anyway, how almost athletic the process, almost athletic the process feels. It feels very biological. The process of making feels very biological and very physical. It doesn't feel like an intellectual process. Now, again, having said that, and this is really important, which is that that's a modal type of behavior. In other words, there are moments, vast moments, where I'm alone in the studio, and I'm copiously taking notes and attempting to both research and to think very deeply about the content, character, formal, contextual, and material components of the work. And without that, I think one doesn't work without the other. But in a way, there's a kind of intelligence to just pouring this emulsion. The feel of skim coating properly a screen has a kind of different type of intelligence built into it that I think is underplayed in the process of making something really. I think the intelligence of this kind of activity that I'm involved in right now is every bit as important as other forms of thinking. So was that done properly? Is that done properly? Isn't that right? Does it feel good? I think so.